What should the world do about the Chinese Communist Party? I've been asking myself this question because obviously I've spent a lot of time making these historical comparison videos and a bit about the historical background of the party. And it's all very interesting, but at the end of the day you can spend all the time in the world talking about how complicated the system is, as if it's very, very complicated, but at the end of the day it's really not that complicated. I mean, it's a giant authoritarian state that's carrying out a genocide in its minority regions and imprisoning and executes millions of people a year, and is currently trying to expand this same system to other countries. And so the question is, what do we do about it? Because I think there's actually quite a lot of things that can be done basically on a government level and on an individual level. And at the moment, the state of the world has just been incredibly cowardly when it comes to standing up to China. The only government that really stands up to them, I'd say, is the United States. And even with Trump, who is thought of as a kind of China hawk, he barely does it. He can't even bring himself to say things like China's a human rights violator, China's killing ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. And so this seems to be the best the world can do at the moment. And so I think there just needs to be a broader coming together between democratic countries, not trying to work through, these international bodies like the UN or the World Health Organization, because it just won't work. There needs to be a kind of coalition of democratic countries. Obviously the US, Canada, Europe, Australia, they need to be basically aligned against what China's doing. On a strategic level and on a moral level, and issue condemnations. You've kind of seen the beginning of this when they issued the letter of condemnation about Xianjiang. But it's pretty weak stuff so far, to be honest. On a strategic level, there are signs of a military relationship. So there's this organization called the Quad, which was a quadrilateral alliance originally between America, Japan, India and Australia, which was an attempt to limit China's influence in the Pacific. And it's just recently been expanded to include Vietnam, New Zealand and South Korea, which is a very good development. It seems to be mostly focusing on emergency containment, but I think this should expand to include military capacity. And it could basically be the beginning of a kind of NATO in the Pacific. But the main thing that needs to happen is to identify the fronts that the CCP is using to spread its influence and then to combat it. Because the threat is very real. I mean, you have the excursions in the South China Sea that's been happening over the last couple of years, and the building of artificial islands, but you also have recently leaked plans that they're rehearsing an invasion of a Taiwanese island. And so this is only getting worse and not better. As well as the military excursions, you have cyber warfare. And at the moment, the Chinese government is engaged in a global cyber warfare campaign, mostly against the United States, but around the whole world, and it's actually attempting to stop research into COVID-19 and to stop development of a vaccine. And so I think in response to this, the main thing that needs to happen is an expansion of the ban on Huawei to include basically any company that comes from China, any tech company. So Xiaomi, Alibaba, Tencent, TikTok, Zoom, all of that stuff should just be not allowed in any democratic country. Because all of them are required under Chinese law to share their data with the Chinese government. I mean, the moving of supply chains is happening already, but I think it needs to be subsidized. We've seen this kind of happening very recently with Taiwanese suppliers who decided to shift their supply chain to Taiwan. That's very good, and I hope more countries will follow that example. And I do think that Chinese social media should just be banned in democratic countries. They shouldn't be allowed to use it because, firstly, it's used to monitor Chinese citizens abroad, it's used to surveil them, report back on what they're doing. And secondly, if they weren't allowed to use them, then Chinese citizens would be forced to use a VPN to contact their relatives. Basically, it would help them integrate a lot better into Western society because they wouldn't be in these little isolated communities where they're only absorbing Chinese news. And yes, the CCP would make hay out of this and say, aha, look, they ban our apps and therefore, there's nothing wrong with our Great Firewall, but, I think we're past that, really. I think another thing that totally needs to happen is that Western countries should basically just attempt to bring down the Great Firewall, because this is totally a doable thing. The technology of the Great Firewall is all based on Western technology, so it's not like we don't know how any of this stuff works. It's mainly controlled by the cyberspace administration department and operates out of, data centers, but it's really not very difficult to hack, Chinese companies. I mean, Vietnam recently hacked them to get information about the virus, so if Vietnam can hack them, I'm pretty sure most Western countries can. The fourth big one, this one's a little bit controversial, is about migration. Because for a long time, China has basically been enticing its citizens to try and steal technology from other countries. And not just that, but also incite them to go on protests and attack people who criticize China. And this is kind of a difficult one because you don't want to label Chinese people in general, or Chinese immigrants, as fifth columnists, or to make them kind of singled out and targeted. Because many Chinese citizens move to Western countries because they dislike their government, and they want to completely integrate into Western society. But at the same time, there is a group within the Chinese diaspora that are just being used as agents of the CCP. And I think the best way to combat this would be to outright stop all immigration from China from Chinese citizens who have connections with the party, either are party members, or if they're students, parents or family are party members. And this would be a difficult thing to prove, but basically if you put the burden on them to show that they're not a party member, that would actually be a fairly effective way of containing party influence in Western countries. And we know that a lot of them are party members basically to play the stock market, but that would actually mean that if Chinese people want their children to study abroad, which a lot of them do, they basically can't then be a party member, and then they would decide not to be, so that would actually have a big effect on stopping the influence of the party. And I think as well as that, all countries should just stop any of these exchanges, like technology conferences or business conferences, all of this stuff, because they're just basically used as a way to steal technology or to gain insider information. They shouldn't let any companies do this. And I hope many more countries will follow Sweden's example and just shut down the Confucius Institutes, because they're just a propaganda front spreading CCP cancer around the world. And, they should be totally banned. They've recently just been stirring up nationalist protests in Australia, and so the faster they get shut down, the better. The other part of this, which is a bit more complicated, is the kind of overall financial strategy and what that should be, because on the one hand, you've got the idea that China's got this amazing Made in China 2025 development strategy, and it's got the Belt and Road, and that if you don't do something to combat it, it's going to take over the world and will be the great new power. On the other hand, the Chinese economy for a long time has actually been pretty bad. It's recently declared 100 billion in non-performing loans as part of the Belt and Road. I mean, 100 billion is not a small amount of money. And so a lot of these are just really bad investments and are not going very well, which is why they end up, defaulting on their debts. But then on the other hand, in the past, China's been very willing to lose a lot of money just to gain the strategic leverage that it wants as a political strategy. And so I think one of the things that could be done about this is basically to approach the more vulnerable, poorer countries that are being approached with Belt and Road initiatives, and to first of all say, okay, we'll step up state investment, whether it's Europe or America or Australia, wherever. We'll guarantee you more state investment in infrastructure, and we'll offer you better, basically give them a better deal and say, we'll only do this if you back off the Belt and Road. And if you do decide to go with the Belt and Road, we'll sanction you. If you were able to get that on an international front, that'd have a pretty powerful effect. Definitely you should completely sanction any companies abroad like Huawei, ZTE, DJI that are involved in the Xianjiang camps, which we know about from the leaks, that are actively involved in producing the social credit system and facial recognition technology which is being used to repress the Uyghurs there. And you also have many Western companies like Apple, HTC, Nike. The Xianjiang labour camps are being used to produce their products, basically being used as slave labour, and so they should be sanctioned unless they actively stop that. The other financial aspect is the mergers with Chinese companies. Now, you might have heard of this documentary called The China Hustle. It's based off a document that found in around from 2009 to 2011, you had a practice where lots of American and European companies got bought up by Chinese companies in the wake of the financial crisis. And later it was found that most of these companies, or a great deal of them, were basically just fronts. All their accounts were fake. The companies themselves were just fronts for the government, and they were basically being used as a strategy for the Chinese government to acquire Western companies by lying about their financial accounts And so they will definitely use the same trick again to try and acquire companies in the wake of this financial crisis. And so several European companies have tried to ban and stop their companies from being bought by Chinese ones, which is very good. They should definitely keep on doing this. But I also think that currently existing companies should be forced to declare how much of their assets are controlled by Chinese companies, because it's really a matter of state security. So this is in like the broader strategy of decoupling. The idea that, basically we need to decouple the economy from China to stop its influence on the rest of the world. It's definitely should happen. The virus is accelerating it anyway, which is good. So Japan kind of led the way in this, and now the US is also doing the same thing. It's been going on anyway because of the trade war. And so European countries really have to follow in the wake of Japan and America. And I think these companies have to be given subsidies or maybe a longer term period to leave China. I mean, they're losing incredible amounts of money, and so to expect these companies to just leave of their own accord, I think in many cases is naive. So you need government intervention to make sure that it happens. So what can people do personally in their regular lives if you're just an individual? I mean, the first obvious thing, and it's been talked about a lot recently, but try not to buy products from China. And actually this is quite a hard thing to do, because really most consumer products are made in China still. But really just check the labels, because with clothes, you can find a lot of clothes that are made from Vietnam instead of China. Definitely try and get those ones if you can. Try not to buy products that are known to be used in the Xianjiang camps as slave labour to produce these products. Again, I mentioned a few before, but specifically there's a big list that's been produced by the Financial Times and other outlets. Try and avoid products specifically that come from that list, because it's basically funding the slave camps in Xinjiang. The other thing that people can do is go to protests. I mean, not now, obviously, when we're all locked down, but once all this is over, go to protests protesting China's influence, because there's definitely going to be quite a few. If there aren't, help organise them. There's most of these are actually now attended by the Chinese diaspora, and so, get in touch with them, help to organise this stuff. Thirdly, you can write to your local representative if you live in a democratic country. You can petition your local MP or your senator or whoever your representative might be. They do take this into account, because otherwise they're only going to be hearing from these Chinese lobbyist groups like the Confucius Institute saying, oh, don't discriminate against Chinese people, I speak for the Chinese people. It will help them know that the people that they're hearing from aren't representative of the entire Chinese community. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I've been thinking about recently. I think all these measures taken together would have a real impact, and it would be nice to see some of them happening and to be really stepped up, because at the moment the response, I feel, has been very, very weak. Let me know what you guys think. If you think some of these measures are too harsh or wouldn't work, or if you have any better ideas, I'd like to hear them. Thank you for listening.